You really want to talk to that piece of puke?
Hello and welcome to another Bad Movie Review. This time we are looking at Drive-In Massacre. This is a 1976 film from director Stu Segall. Runtime is about an hour and 14 minutes. And it was written by John Jeff and George Buck Flower and Stu Segall. George Buck Flower has written a bunch of movies. B-movies, adult entertainment movies, all sorts of stuff. Really across the board. And a lot of them are pretty consistently fun to watch. So this one takes place in a drive-in theater, as you would guess. Now, a lot of the cast in here are actually pseudonyms when you look at the opening credits, because this was a non-union film, so they couldn't use their real names or they would get in trouble with SAG. So John Goff is aka Jake Barnes in this, and he is one of the police detectives. He's one of the more recognizable people. So is Bruce Kimball, the other detective. We also have Jacqueline Garreau, Janice Blythe. George Flower actually plays one of the suspects in the warehouse. Verkina Flower, Catherine Barkley, Robert Pearson, and John Alderman. Now, a lot of the people in this are not recognizable names or faces, but now some of them did have other credits, but largely these are unknowns. So we start off with some really shaky camera work during the opening credits, which is not typically very inspiring. So you can tell right away this is a pretty low budget production. Now, legend has it that this was filmed in about 5 days, and it kind of looks that way. It does look like it did have a lot of technical issues, which we'll get into a little more in a moment. So we start off with a guy named Alan and his girlfriend making out in the car, and they quickly become our first victims. Alan is reaching out to get the speaker, but his girlfriend wants to make out, so she's kind of pulling him away, and he's leaning out of the car, and bam, his head gets chopped off. It's not super gory, but you see the stump, so it's bloody, and then she buys it too, so you get 2 kills pretty early on in the film. And then we meet our 2 pudgy detectives, Detective John Koch and Detective Mike Leary, played by Goff and Kimball, and they have some pretty fun banter in this very obviously generic set that they're on that is just 2 desks that are supposed to be a police station. Now, we learn that the manager, Austin Johnson, played by Robert Pearson, is kind of a known jerk in the area. He is given a great description by one of the detectives, but this manager is largely indifferent to what's going on. He explains that before this was a drive-in, it was a circus and possibly a brothel. And when the circus shut down, the owner of the circus turned it into a drive-in, which was supposed to be more profitable. And the manager's there all the time. He's complaining he's underpaid. He says he's not giving a living wage, and that he doesn't trust his employees, that are always trying to rip him off, and he even has to run the projector. Now, the detectives notice that there is a man walking around picking up trash, and the manager has some very bad things to say about that gentleman, including that he is of low intelligence, calling him a half-wit, and it turns out that guy's name is Jeremy. Apparently it might have been Jormy at one point, but he's just nicknamed Jeremy. And he lives at the drive-in, as well as picking up trash and kind of keeping people from being destructive and making out. He walks around with a flashlight and is annoying, apparently. But he's super willing to help the cops, to a detriment almost. But we do learn from him that there is a peeping Tom who likes to go around and watch couples make out. The police end up being able to track down the pervert, and there's some really funny dialogue in that scene. He does try and take off on them, and it ends up not being enough to hold him. It's a little voiceover bit that they do, and they end up having to go undercover at the drive-in with one of them wearing a wig and a dress to try and catch the pervert in the act, because he's their best suspect. Well, unfortunately, things don't really work out on that front, and a couple more killings happen while the officers are there. And Johnson, the manager, is refusing to close the drive-in. He tells them that he's actually making more money now because of the killings, which apparently is bringing in more people to the drive-in for some reason. prison. Then we get this scene with a guy in a warehouse who is holding this girl hostage, and that's actually Buck Flower, as I mentioned earlier. And he's said to have killed 2 people with a machete just before this warehouse showdown. The warehouse scene is actually really well done with some really good overlay music. It's probably the best point in the movie for music. And at one point, there's even this cool heartbeat sound that's subtly put in to ratchet up the tension. And I thought that worked really, really well. But after that gets resolved, we end up back at the drive-in for the close of the film. And during the lead up to the final confrontation in the film, there's a really cool effect they do where there's like this heavy breathing or rapid fire breathing. If it had been a little more subtle, it would have been incredibly effective, but it was just a little too loud. So just be aware of that if you're making film. You can make use of just about anything for a sound effect that could really ratchet up tension. Now, overall, the movie was not bad. It's not really a slasher film. It's an early slasher, part of the golden age of slasher films. And a lot of people start the slasher genre in 78 with Halloween, but that's really not true. It really started closer to 74, and this movie is definitely early slasher. It still has the early stages of slasher to it because it's more of a police procedural, like a bloody, gory episode of Law and Order than an actual slasher film as we know them now. But that is largely due to the slasher genre being defined more by like this late 70s, early 80s with movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th. But there were slasher films like this one that had a lot of the same cliches in them. People fooling around with premarital sex, getting chopped up with swords, things like that. So this is definitely in the slasher genre. It's just a variation of it, an early variation of it, before Halloween and Friday the 13th really solidified what slasher films were as a genre. So we've got a body count of 9 in this one. There are references to the 2 dead people by the machete killer in the warehouse, but we never actually see those. Now, a couple of these killings are off screen, but we see the results of them, so I did count those, but not the 2 the machete killer said to have done. And we have only one plot point, and it's a real brief scene. Now, this movie does suffer from some technical issues, primarily being that the night shots are often out of focus. Sometimes the musical score is a little wonky and weird, but I can kind of forgive that because there are some really cool scenes where the music works really, really well. But other times it's a little goofy, and there are a few scenes that drag out a little too long. The police station scenes are a bit long. Even though they are adding context to it, they're a bit long in their editing. If they had been taken down a little bit, they could have added a little bit more gore in or an extra victim or something like that. So there is some downtime in here, but I think it's mostly for police procedural aspects of this. You have to remember that this movie is pre-Halloween, so it really hasn't had that influence on it for the slasher aspect, so there's still this almost police procedural dragnet kind of feel to a lot of these era of movies where they're trying to establish motive and crime busting onto the film as well, instead of just focusing on the killers and victims. And this came out just after The Town That Dreaded Sundown, even though this was probably filmed around the same time or before that. But The Town That Dreaded Sundown came out in December of 76, and this was actually released in January of 1977. But overall, I liked this movie. I thought it was actually pretty fun. It has some really good one-liners in it, so the writing was pretty solid. It just had a few editing choices that I wouldn't have gone with. The warehouse scene was really well done. There's some great overhead shots, great tension building, and you really don't know who the killer is. Even at the end when they reference who the killer might be, it's not who they allude to. And this movie definitely is of its time, but I think if you're having like a slasher movie marathon, this would be a worthy addition because it did have some really cool elements to it. It did have some decent tension in it, and the victims are very much regular slasher victims. There's no final girl because that hasn't been established as a slasher cliche yet. So you actually have the police as your protagonists, and you're kind of following through them. And they have some pretty fun dialogue. And it was a nice change of pace from a standard slasher film because it doesn't have to follow follow those constant cliches that get a little tiresome when you're watching slasher flicks. So I did like that. It does have a few points where it is kind of slow moving, but again, that's because it's a different style of film. It's leaning more toward the police procedural aspects than it is the slasher film genre stereotypes. And at the very end, if you had watched this in a drive-in, this would have been more effective, but they have a voiceover at the end that's meant to kind of startle the audience. And it loses a lot of effect if you're watching this at home on video, because it's designed specifically to be targeted at those at the drive-in and kind of ratchet up the fear. And I thought overall the movie was really fun. It does have kind of a similar feel to The Town That Dreaded Sundown in the aspects that it's kind of trying to portray this as recreating an actual event, but it really isn't going to work that way if you're not seeing this at a drive-in. Now, finding this movie in a really nice print is going to be a little bit more difficult. It did get a Blu-ray release, but it doesn't seem to have been a large print run, and I would try and find it on a streaming service that's streaming it in high quality, or get the Blu-ray. As a physical media person, I have it on DVD, but I haven't been able to track a Blu-ray copy down for a reasonable price yet. But I would definitely get a high quality transfer of this, because the lower quality ones, the dark scenes look really, really dark, and it does detract from it because a bad print of film really doesn't transfer well. So I think this is a good addition to any slasher collection because it is pre-Halloween and has a lot of different elements to it, but still follows a lot of the same slasher cliches without the final girl. So an interesting change of pace that was actually pretty smartly written. It's got a few flaws, but nothing you can't get over. And it only an hour and 14 minutes. It definitely doesn't take very long to get to the fun parts. A solid recommendation for a good B movie, and definitely worth a view. But that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.